Hello, everyone. Before we get into today's episode, as always, we'd like to thank our executive producers, Tom McCool, Tony Turrin, Justus Ebel, and Jeremy Marcoux. If you'd like to help support the show, you can check us out at patreon.com/historiesmost or send us an email at histories.most@gmail.com for any comments, feedback, or suggestions. Thanks so much, and now, on with the episode. In the last episode, we questioned the traditional narrative of the 5th century in Britain, the so-called Dark Ages, a time where society collapsed and very quickly chaos ensued, towns were abandoned, and cultures were erased. We asked, what if that wasn't how it happened? And if it didn't, what did? In this episode, we ask the same question, and we hear a different view. What if instead of a rapid change, it was a gradual evolution into something else? One that was not as chaotic or violent as we may have been led to believe. The fact that we have differing views from historians on the topic is what makes it so fascinating. The fact that there's no agreed upon consensus for what exactly happened is what makes it so mysterious. And it's what helps make it, certainly, history's most puzzling century. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another very special episode of History's Most. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex. And for our second discussion about history's most puzzling century, a title actually that we owe to today's guest, it's my pleasure to say we're joined by Susan Westhuizen, Emeritus Professor of Medieval Archaeology at Cambridge University, author of The Emergence of the English. Thanks so much, Susan, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start then slightly before our puzzling century that has been labelled, perhaps erroneously, the Dark Ages. But before we get to the 5th century AD, there is quite a lot of mystery still surrounding late Roman Britain, I think it's fair to say. Things are definitely going on. How much we can really say about what's going on is another question. But what's your kind of picture that you think is happening maybe in kind of 4th century Britain?
I think if we were going to talk about the 4th century, and we'd really be talking about the end of the century as far as I'm concerned, rather than the early or the middle. And I think the problem with Roman Britain generally, and particularly with the 4th century, is that everyone expects history when you describe it, that you see a picture that is static, that this is what it was like. And that description then applies to decades and decades, perhaps even to the whole century. Whereas, of course, we know from our own lives how rapidly things can change within just, for example, if just take the last 18 months, has been an extremely dramatic change in all our lives across the globe. And the changes that will be consequent from that could be far-reaching. They might not be, but they might be. And so to see Roman Britain as a static episode is difficult. It's also difficult because Roman Britain was experienced differently in different parts of the country, and by different sectors. So if you were a peasant farmer, then your life might not have changed a great deal over the Roman period, except, of course, that there were changes in technology. The things you used might have changed, but you still had to make your living by going out and ploughing every day or looking after your beasts or whatever it was. The taxes that were due, the renders that you had to give to the landowner, those things might have changed, but the fundamental experience of your life probably wouldn't have changed. But then if you were living in a town, then things might have changed quite a lot. So there's this period, and we see in the 4th century, we can see that there's a decline in the occupation of towns. Nobody really understands why. There's an increase in what's called dark earth in the towns, which is kind of like compost, but again, nobody can explain it adequately. There are raids on Britain from the north, from Scotland, from the Picts, and from Ireland, from the Scots. Why that is like that, I can't tell you, but it's very confusing for those of us who are used to thinking of Scots being from Scotland. Anyway, that's a whole other story. And occasionally also attacks from across the North Sea, but they don't seem to have been very, very frequent. I think probably the main things that changed for the upper echelon were changes in the way that Britain was governed. So there were problems around who the emperor was. The troops in Britain there were 3 mutinies in Britain towards the end of the 4th century, in each putting a different emperor in place, who then went on to challenge the emperor in Rome. And that must have had an effect on the hierarchy. People came back and wondered who was involved. And then at some point, at the end of the 4th or in the early 5th century, Roman administration was withdrawn from Britain. Nobody knows why that happened or how it happened, whether it happened fast or slow. And increasingly, people are beginning to think that military units of the Roman army were left in Britain and continued to be here right the way through the 5th century, although they might by then have evolved into units independent of Rome. But nonetheless, there were in places continuous garrisons. For example, along Hadrian's Wall, those soldiers never left. So the 4th century is a complicated century, really, for Rome. In some ways, there's even continuity, prosperity. In other ways, there's hubbub, turmoil. And in other places, there's simply processes, historical processes that happen in any century for which we don't have to look for a cataclysmic answer. I'm thinking there of the decline of the towns. And of course, then there's Christianity was introduced. That's a whole new change. So it's a changing century. And, that's really what one would expect.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good point that it's so easy, isn't it, to sit 1,500 years later and be like, this is what it was like then, when, of course, we can only ever have a snapshot of something that was dynamic and moving constantly at the time. And actually, I think that feeds in quite nicely, because I wanted to talk about your approach to the 5th century and the changes that happened that obviously we know fragments about. But I think one of the things that sums up, and again, I don't want to kind of presume, but that I would take away from reading your work is that you kind of focus on that dynamism, the kind of constant change, the constant evolution. So would you mind just kind of explaining a little bit how you approach the 5th century?
Well, the approach to the 5th century then is divided into 2 parts. There are 2 answers, and then there are different aspects of your question. The first is about change over time. There's a very famous French historian called Fernand Braudel, who proposed quite a long time ago that if you want to understand historical change, you have to look at things that change very, very slowly. So that he said, look at the agricultural background, and that's what I do. I'm a landscape historian, archaeologist, and I'm interested in how people farmed the land and how that changed over time. And the answer is very, very slowly. And Braudel said, if you want to understand how things change, you need to set them against that background. If you only look at the change itself, for example, if you only look at the decline of towns in late Roman Britain, you only look at that, then it's hard to measure when the process began and when it ended, and what the influences on it might have been. Whereas if you set it against a broader background of long-term history, the shorter term, medium term, I suppose I should say, history of the decline of towns, and then events that happen in the short term. I mean, our pandemic is a very good example of that. The history then has depth. And in that way, one's able not only to measure what has changed and what has remained the same over a period, but also one can judge the influence of short-term episodes and medium-term processes on how a society evolves across that period. So that's one of the answers to your question. So I don't know if you want to talk about that now, and then we can go on to the other in a minute.
Yeah, of course. I think, well, for one thing, I think people always look for historical events, don't they? An event that then changes things, an event that has a cause and effect,
Yes.
a cause and consequence, nice, simple to understand cycle. And then something goes from being like this to being like that.
Yes.
And that, I think, is like you kind of explained very well. It really, what we have to kind of get our heads around, I suppose, with the 5th century is because we have I don't know what the right phrase would be, a traditional narrative, which is very an event, and then things are different afterwards because of it. So if we want to look at continuity and change in the long aspect, do you think it would have been let's use your example of archaeology of agriculture. Do you think, which is of course what most people would have been doing at that time, would there have been more continuity than change, do you think?
Yes, and I went to a very interesting book launch the other day. Somebody said didn't like the word continuity because it implied stasis, that things remain the same. Whereas, of course, change, nothing ever remains the same. There's always evolution over time. So he talked about adaptation and evolution and innovation, which are the words I like as well. But continuity is definitely the word that is prominent within my discipline. It's either continuity or discontinuity, and things are not that simple either. So in the agricultural sector, I think that by and large, yes, people's lives did stay the same. I mean, the things they used changed. They used Roman stuff instead of Iron Age stuff. At the end of the Roman period, they used different stuff again. Might have buried their neighbors differently. They might have taken their cattle to different pastures. But fundamentally, the cycle, the agricultural cycle, determined what they were doing, because you can't defer planting this year, because if you do, next year your children will starve. You have to plant this year, regardless of what is happening. If there's a drought, if there's too much rain, if your neighbor is being aggressive, if your landlord is being too grasping, if somebody's, your children are trying to get you off your land, whatever it is, you simply have to plant every year. So there's a long-term, there is a continuity of practice there. About cause and effect. Yes, and cause and effect is quite an interesting concept, partly because when people look at the past, particularly the more distant the past becomes, they like there to be a simple, rational reason why something happened. And the great landscape historian Christopher Taylor is very fond of reminding us that people do things for all sorts of reasons, many of which are completely irrational. And if we look for the reason why a village moved from X place to Y place, and we say, oh, well, it was because there was a Black Death, or, the lords came in and decided it wanted to be somewhere else. Or, it might just have been that they decided they didn't like that place anymore. And that the reasons might have been completely irrational. They might have been, I don't know, that they all took against a particular neighbor. I mean, who can, there's something completely irrational. So that the problem with cause and effect is that it assumes there's a rational explanation for everything, and there isn't. Sometimes there is, and sometimes it isn't. And the other problem with cause and effect is that it's incredibly simple. So for our period, 5th century, the cause and effect, there are two causes and effects. The first is that the Roman administration was withdrawn from Britain, and it was disaster. Everything just went to pot. Towns fell into ruins. The economy was completely disrupted. People were forced into a hand-to-mouth existence. And then the next cause is the supposed arrival from Northwest Europe of a large group of people who this then saved the country by taking on positions of leadership. So the cause, and there's kind of cause from disaster, a cause that leads to disaster, to another cause that leads to salvation. The problem with that is that actually that isn't how history works. And if anyone were to ask any of us, if any of our children were to ask us now or at any time in the future, why did Brexit happen? Could any of us think of a simple cause and effect explanation like that? Or even one that was particularly rational? There are things that are rational to one person, not necessarily rational to someone else. So cause and effect is a really problematic way of approaching the past.
And I think one of the things, just to pick up on, you're talking, rational and irrational motivations, I suppose it's a lot harder for us, whether it's in written source material or archaeology, to understand irrational causes after the event, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That's, I suppose, one of the reasons we desperately grasp for irrational, because we want to explain. And we can't know, like you said, if someone fell out with a neighbor and persuaded the whole village to move, we can't know that so far removed, which is kind of part of the magic and frustration of this century, I think, isn't it? Did you want to then talk about, if we've got the whole change, continuity, evolution, dynamism, whatever, what's the kind of second aspect you wanted to talk about of your approach?
Okay, so what about my approach? So now, I've for many years, I've been reading other people's research, because that's how one, if you want to build up a picture, you have to read what other people have written, and the more you read, the better. So there comes a limit to how much you can read in the end, but the more you can read, the better. And when I was a student here, I was taught the traditional story about the migration from Northwest Europe, and that remained and still remains in many places the dominant story. But from about the maybe even the mid-80s onwards, I began to read more and more pieces of research which said that cannot have been the case. Most of them were specialists in one area or another of archaeology. So, for example, people looking at what happened in cemeteries began to say, look, we can't find any evidence of that migration in the cemeteries. So people who looked at pots began to say, well, actually, we thought that the pots that they used in the 5th century were quite different from the ones they used in the 4th. But actually, now that we look at them, there were quite a few that are very similar. And it looks as though we've got the same people working, making pots in the 5th century as we're making in the 4th, but they're simply making a different sort of pot, completely different sort of pot. And then there was somebody who did some work on weaving, and she found a particular sort of woven cloth, all hand woven, of course. On a loom, but not machine woven. And we found a particular sort of cloth which could not have been woven on a 5th century, at a conventional 5th or 6th century loom. Can only have been woven on a 4th century or earlier loom. And so they have to think of very complicated examples to explanations for this. But the obvious answer is actually that what you're seeing is the same people occupying the landscape over time. So as time went on, I'm sorry, this is getting rather long, but as time went on, I began to read more and more of this research, and I began to realize that we have a real problem in trying to explain the 5th century, because we take too much for granted. We assume that we know what happened. And the more that historians and archaeologists have been looking at that evidence over the past 30 years or so, the more they have been having difficulty in making that explanation stick. And so I thought, well, I would just experiment with saying, what happens if we don't take anything for granted? Let's just forget what we think we know. Let's pretend we know nothing. Look at the evidence and see where it leads us. Maybe it will lead us to the same place, that everything depends on this migration episode, or maybe it won't. But unless we start looking at the evidence with a fresh eye. In the end, we're going round and round in circles, trying to fit evidence that doesn't fit into an explanation that no longer works. And that's not useful for anybody. So that's my approach. It's not actually about debunking. It's about saying, let's look again without preconceptions at what the evidence tells us.
And it's so easy, isn't it, to fall into the trap of doing history backwards,
Yes.
of knowing where you end up and therefore filling in the beforehands. I mean, it's, you know, something of my own kind of specialism is completely different, but the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Nazis,
Yes.
it ends with Hitler, right? So everything else has to inform how you get there. But it's really unhelpful because, of course, people were not, you know, living it forwards rather than backwards. Now, that's quite a nice, I think, segue, I suppose, into, because you start off in the Emergence of the English. It's really refreshing, actually, read, because it starts off by saying, what can we actually reliably say did happen in this period? What can we kind of cast iron say did happen? It's not very much, is it? But that kind of gets rid of our starting point being the end, being almost Bede's England. If we get rid of that, as we've got to work backwards from there. So obviously the obvious question then is what can we say?
Well, I think the thing that seems that the two sources that we have, which are the nearest to that period, are the Memoirs of St. Patrick, which were written sometime in the middle of the 5th century. He was born somewhere along the northwestern coast of Britain. So you have his memoirs about his childhood and his adulthood in that area. And the other source is the fire and brimstone sermons of a priest called Gildas, who also seems to have lived in the west of England. And the things that they reliably say, these are British sources, they're also sources from abroad. The things that they reliably say is that the forms of government introduced by the Roman Empire continued to be practiced. They were evolving, they were changing, they were innovating, but their roots lay in Roman Britain. There were town councils, which on whose members were the leading society of the locality. Patrick's father was one of those. They tended to be villa owners. They tended to have Latin names. They spoke a sort of vernacular Latin. So Roman administration continues. We've talked already about how units of the Roman army remained here and evolved themselves. In other places, towns employed units of auxiliaries to defend them against one or another attack, and they employed them in exactly the same way, on exactly the same terms as the Roman army had done. And that's Gildas talking, which is something like, I don't know, the early 6th century, the 520s perhaps. So what's that? The army, that's this administration. There were judges with law courts, there were prisons, and those judges and law were following Roman law, or how the evolution of Roman law. There was the church, Roman Christianity, of course, introduced as an official religion into Britain in the 4th century. There were bishops, there were priests, there were monasteries. So the large-scale continuity of the structures of the institutions of the Roman Empire, but not exactly the same in 500 as they had been in 400. No society works like that. They had changed, they were adapting, but their roots lay in the Roman Empire, and the people of the country seem to have seen themselves as Roman in some sense, however they defined it. They might not have defined it in the same way. Gildas, for example, may not have defined it in the same way as somebody living towards the end of the 4th century might have defined it, but he still thought of himself as Roman. He still thought it was perfectly reasonable that that one should send a messenger to Rome and ask the emperor to send, or Constantinople by then, to send an army to support him. And so they thought of themselves as Roman. Agriculture continued. The economy almost certainly didn't tank. There was coin continued to be imported into Britain. And Dr. James Gerard at Newcastle suspects that because the economy was 90% dependent on agriculture, and it was the largest economic sector in the country and remained that right the way until the agricultural revolution, that because it was such a large sector, it had perhaps never used money very much anyway. And so the loss of large-scale coin distribution in the 5th century may not have been the disaster that everybody thinks it was. So, and then Gildas, of course, talks about a prosperous country, a stable country. And then in the 430s, St. Germanus, a bishop from France, comes into Britain, asked by the Pope to address a heresy here. And he says exactly the same thing. He finds a stable society with all the Roman institutions, it's wealthy and at peace. And sometimes being attacked, it was attacked in the Roman period too. And the attacks are repelled and the country then restored to peace. So that's what the sources tell us about the 5th century, which is very different from what the accepted narrative says about the 5th century, which is that there was turmoil in practically every part of everyday life that one could think of.
So do you think we should, obviously we've talked about, Gildas, and you can hardly talk about the 5th century without talking about Gildas because he's more or less, he's the only British contemporary source who tries to write a history of the period. Well, he isn't trying to write a history of the period, actually. Sorry, that's the big problem, is that he's clearly not trying to do that. Now, obviously, he does paint this picture of the world he's living in is stable, prosperous, a pleasant land. It's almost something out of like kind of Victorian literature, kind of green and pleasant land. But that's fiercely contrasted with what he says came before his time. He's clear. Before his time, there was chaos. There's invasion. There is, an unnamed tyrant of a king who ruins everything, and there is a long war against what is, again, possibly looking backwards, presumed this Saxon invasion. Should we discard what Gildas says about the unstable past before he lived?
I'm not absolutely sure he's talking about the past or myself, but anyway, I mean, whether it's the past or not is neither here nor there really for the argument. The most recent research on Gildas, which is by Professor Nick Hyam and Dr. Guy Halsall, and particularly Dr. James Harland, they see Gildas as contrasting what he sees as virtuous behavior, which is adhering to what he thinks is a kind of Roman way of life, with unvirtuous behavior. And so when he talks about units being brought into Britain to support the towns, what he calls Saxon units being brought into towns to help to defend them, he says afterwards they went home. And so he contrasts that, which is a very conventional way of using troops. He contrasts that with, I can't remember the term he exactly uses, but he may well say tyrants in the east of England who fixed their terrible claws into the country. And the consensus appears to be that there Gildas is talking about people who were using troops to try to bolster their own territorial claims, to, in a sense, you might say, to foment civil war. And that's what Gildas is having a go at. It's not that he's contrasting the Roman past with the perfect present. He's contrasting virtuous behavior with behavior that he strongly disapproves of. And those are the ones that he is so excoriating about. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there kind of is a train of thought maybe that rather than Anglo-Saxon invasions, whatever they may have been, that in fact we have more like a kind of Romano-British civil war in which the key element is federate foreign Germanic troops. Is that maybe a better way to look at whatever conflict might have happened in the 5th century?
Britain was a very regional, it still is a very regional country. If I live in Cambridgeshire, if I go into Norfolk, it's a very different place. People speak differently. They have different dialectical words. It's a different landscape. People see themselves as being different from one area of Britain to another. And that's probably always been the case. I'd like to come back to this question of federal troops. The thing is that people have been moving around Britain ever since ever since the country became populated after the last ice age. People came back into England. They had to come from what is now over the Channel, but at that time was part of the European continent. They moved in and they moved out. And they moved across Britain from one end to the other. And over the millennia that have intervened between then and now, and including the 5th century, people were moving into Britain and they were moving out and they were moving across the country. So the question about what happened in relation to migration in the 5th century is, was there a change in migration in that period? That is, did more people come? Did people come from a different part of the world outside Britain than they had done before, with their greater dominance of one group rather than another? And what impact, if any, did that mobility have? What cultural impact did it have? So if we're going to be talking about Saxon federates, auxiliary troops, yes, they were brought into Britain, and yes, they were part of the Roman army. But what we haven't established, and we'll probably come to this later, is that there was any substantial immigration into Britain from Northwest Europe in the 5th or 6th centuries. And remember that the population of Britain at the end of the Roman period, the late 4th century, something like 5 million people, which is pretty close to the population of this country in about 1700. Farmsteads were in the lowlands, farmsteads were laid out across the hillsides, perhaps only every 150 meters apart. This was a densely populated country. There was no more woodland than there is today, and perhaps even less. So it was a densely populated and exploited country. So if you're going to put all the emphasis on change, you're going to make a group of immigrants take the burden for cultural change. It's a very small group by comparison. So to come back to what was happening in Britain, there are plenty of places where the administration, the characteristics of Roman administration were carried on by local populations right the way through, forever. There are lots of places in Britain which have a place name element Wick. Not every single one of them is one of these, but there are many places which are. And that Wick, for example, places like Wickham, are that first element Wick is derived from Vicus, which is the Latin word for a very small Roman town. So in those places, one can, if it's called a vicus because it's administered by in a distinctively Roman way, then it's definitely going to be that throughout. You're not going to call it that if it doesn't continue. There are places where there is this long-term continuity, and Matthias Fafinski has just brought out a really very interesting book on this period. Explains that so much of the administration of the 5th century is carried out on the basis of Roman law. It's not the same Roman law as in 400, evolving, because law does evolve, but it has its roots in the Roman past and it sees itself as Roman. There are some places where place names tell us that a territorial group still regarded itself as being governed in a distinctively Roman, in inverted commas, way. So, for example, there's a suffix called saete, and it means a territorial group with roots in the in the Roman past. And so, for example, Grantchester, just outside Cambridge, is a satyr, and the Grant part of it is the river Granta, which is now called the River Cam. And there's fair evidence to suggest that the whole of the catchment area of the River Cam, which is really very wide, it's quite a large area. Most of the county of Cambridgeshire was organized on the basis of this territorial grouping. There's Somerset is another one of those. It's another satyr name, the Summer. Okay, so again, a large region in which Roman administration continued. So those are just places we can identify by place. And I'm not saying every single place was like that. No doubt there were places where one grouping absorbed another, where there was conflict between groupings. I'm not suggesting some idyllic 5th century in which everybody loved each other. But to see the 5th century as entirely based on warring factions is probably taking it a bit far. I mean, in those days, a war band was considered to be around, and as I recall, about 30 people. You can't do an awful lot of damage with 30 people. I mean, even if they're all psychopaths.
Yeah, and I think one of the things as well that actually in our last episode was mentioned was the fact that 5th century settlements that are dug up are invariably not defended.
No,
they don't have walls or anything like that, which suggests that there was not a clear and present danger.
No, it's such a good point. I really wish I had thought of that, because it's a really, really good point. I heard somebody say that the other day. It's such a good point.
Yeah, it's just a basic thing, isn't it? If warfare was a constant of life in the 5th century, we'd probably see more evidence of it. But as it is, there isn't really any. No. Let's take the bull by the horns. I think let's go straight to the issue of invasion migration, the classic narrative of how Anglo-Saxon England was formed is that tens of thousands, I don't know, purely speculating here, of Germanic peoples from northern Germany, so Denmark, maybe the Netherlands as well, came into the east of England initially as invited as mercenaries, but then decided to take it for themselves. And that the reason that the world that would later be documented by Bede is so English, if we can, if you see what I mean, is because the native British people had been subjugated, in some cases even exterminated. I mean, I think one of the linguistic things, and it might be outdated now, I'm sure you'll tell me if it is, but is the idea that, there's no Brittonic in modern English, so those people must have been forced out or something like this. And yet that narrative, as you said actually earlier on, for about 30 years now, more and more we've started to think we can't actually find the evidence to reinforce that narrative that has come down to us. So what would you say are the really key pieces of evidence that would make you question or disregard that traditional narrative?
It's kind of where should I start, really?
Yeah, just recite your entire book for me, basically.
All right, well, let's start with the archaeology. When one looks at their archaeology nowadays they're able to do two things with it. They're able to look at the things people are buried with, and then they look at how they were buried to see if people are buried in a different way with different things. To backtrack just for an instant, the population of Britain, I probably overegged it by saying 5 million. It's probably between 3 and 5 million in about 400. The numbers, if there had been a large scale, if there had been a large scale grouping of people coming in, then for which actually there is no evidence, that had a large group of people come in, then the only way in which they could have imposed themselves on a very large existing population, which far outnumbered them, would have been by taking over the government from them. So that in the burials, what one ought to see then is one ought to see an important burial, very, very important burial of your putative immigrant, with all his immigrant stuff around him, because obviously they only used their own stuff, refused to use anybody else's. So that's what one ought to find, this very, very important Sutton Hoo-like burial, surrounded by other burials. And because, as everybody knows, our immigrants were pagan, but so many Romano-Britons were Christian, one might very well expect to find the burials on different axes, that the Christians would be lying from west to east, whereas our Germanic leader would be in any sort of orientation that chose. Actually, so what does the burial archaeology show? The burial archaeology shows everybody on the same axis. You can't distinguish one person from another by the things they're buried with. Yes, there are high status burials, but then there's a new technique now, which is called isotope analysis, which is where you look at the enamel in people's teeth. And that enamel is formed when one is a child from the water that one drinks locally. And that water tends to have a distinctive chemical signature because it comes from particular sorts of rocks. So you can't say, well, they definitely come from one place or definitely from another, but you can say which region people came from. And when you look at the high status burials, which jolly well ought to be the ones that we've been talking about, they are not from Northwest Europe. They're usually from somewhere in Britain. They might even not be from the same locality in which they're found, might be from somewhere else in Britain, but they're British. They're not an invader. So that's the problem with the burial archaeology. The landscape, if you look at field systems, if a completely new government came in and took over and reduced the existing population to servitude, it's quite possible that they may well have imposed their own system of land allocation. They would have had their fields differently, they'd have had their pastures, they'd have organized the land differently. There's absolutely no sign of that. The same fields that were plowed in 400 are being plowed in 500, in 800, in 1000, and quite often into the 19th century. There's no sign in the landscape of any sort of disruption. The troops that you refer to were not brought in as mercenaries. They were brought in as auxiliary units to an existing army, and they went home again afterwards. Gildas says that. Bede, the whole of Bede is based on Gildas. We can't substantiate any of Gildas's statements, and Gildas himself has only got one date, and he doesn't give us the date for it. He mentions the battle of Baden, and he doesn't tell us when it was. It's the only dateable thing in the whole of Gildas. So for Gildas, it's impossible to establish a chronology for the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, and Bede is unable to do any more. So we discount Bede because it doesn't add. So then one could come to the DNA. So now there's a big song and dance in about 2016, very fancy paper in Nature, top science journal, which claimed that something like between, can't remember exactly, something like 20 and 40% of British DNA was in inverted commas Anglo-Saxon. So I read the paper, because obviously it's a very important paper, and maybe he was right. So then at the back of these papers, they have an explanation of how they went about the research, because they give you the broad results of all pretty diagrams and everything, and then they say, this is how we did it. And they have a big diagram which shows how the DNA is broken down between origins of different countries. I mean, having said this, I should say that most of the British DNA is 98 point something % identical with everybody else's. Mostly British people are muesli, just like everyone else. So it's just this one little tiny percent within which DNA, which is similar to that of other countries, can be identified. So I had a look at that, and it was very interesting because there was an amount of what they called Germanic DNA, but 3 times that amount of French DNA. Well, that's odd. How do they explain that? So there's a sentence in the explanation which says, yes, well, we did notice the French DNA was 3 times as big as the German, but Bede didn't mention the French, and therefore we left it out. And that is completely the wrong thing to do. If you're doing science, you should go with what the data tells you. If the data tells you there are 3 times as many French as Germans, well, then jolly well say it. And think what an exciting paper that would then have been. It would have burst upon the world. Do you know you're more French than you are German? Well, that would have been a really exciting answer. I mean, of that 1.5% of you that isn't muesli. So the DNA doesn't help. Then some German scientists and British archaeologists have been working on looking at ancient DNA. So again, a very highly publicized article which said we've compared ancient DNA with DNA from a 5th to 8th century cemetery. As it happens, the cemeteries all in Cambridge, it's neither here nor there. But as it happens, they were. So I thought, well, that's jolly exciting. I'd have another look. So the change that they're measuring is from the end of the Roman period, or say you were going to say 350 or 380, so you want to know what the population was like before, and then you measure it again in 500. So that will give you an idea of how much population change, how much mobility there was across the North Sea in that, say, 120, 150-year period. So do they do that? No, they do not. What they do is they take an Iron Age population, which occupied their settlement between 300 and 100 BC, 300 BC to round about 100. Yeah, it's 100 BC. I might be wrong about that, but it's very close. And they compare that with the 5th century. So of course they find change. I mean, it'd be astonishing if they didn't find change. But what they're measuring is change over nearly 700 years. We're not seeing what happens in the 5th century. We're seeing what happens between 0 and 500. And then there were 3 burials from the 8th century, from about 800, late 9th, late 8th, early 9th century. 3 burials, which all did come from Germany. But of course, they're beyond the period when people are meant to have arrived between 400 and 600. Come in 800, well, excusez-moi, but you're a bit late to the party. And in any case, migration is to be expected. Migration is normal. So if we find people who do come from Northwest Europe, it's not amazing. It's part of what you'd expect. What we want to know is whether there were more people than usual coming from that area. And for that, there is no evidence.
I think one of the remarkable things that for me, obviously not a specialist in this era at all, is that, things like the isotope analysis, you find all these quote unquote Anglo-Saxon sites and burials and people buried with Anglo-Saxon goods, which is traditionally always been, well, this is an Anglo-Saxon settlement of migrants. And yet something like the isotope analysis, well, they're all born in Britain. So off the back of that, then, our archaeological evidence isn't showing us large-scale migration.
And actually, that's such a very good point that you just made. I really just like to say that it's a really very, very good point, and I wish I'd said that. That was really good. So sorry, I hope you don't mind my saying that. But really, I'm thinking, damn, I missed a trick there.
Very flattering. What it then does do, though, is it raises another question, doesn't it? If there isn't large-scale migration, or we can't find it at the moment, at least, and there's no reason really other than looking at history backwards. There's no reason why we should be looking for it necessarily. But if there isn't this mass migration that wipes out or displaces the natives, then what actually is happening, and how can we account for the fact that there are changes in, say, material culture? There are people being buried with grave goods and, you know, weapons and armor that you wouldn't have seen in Roman times.
No, well, I don't. To be truthful, I don't know the answer to that. But to ascribe it to migration is to miss a trick. Because if you say, oh, well, this is obviously proves migration. No, it doesn't. It proves that you think it's migration, but it doesn't actually prove that it is. So if we want to say it is migration, what we have to do is then discount all the other possibilities. But maybe it is. I'm not saying it isn't. But you do have to discount all the other possibilities. You can't take migration for granted. And that is what the discipline doesn't do. It doesn't consider other possibilities. So another possibility might be that you're just looking at a difference in trade patterns, that instead of trade coming mostly from the Mediterranean and from Gaul, it's now mostly coming from the North Sea. And Tom Williamson at UEA has done this marvelous map where he turns the whole North Sea area upside down, and he shows how all the rivers of England along the east coast face into a North Sea that takes in on the western coast of Norway, a little bit of Sweden, the whole of the western coast of Denmark, the Low Countries, and of course the rivers that drain into the North Sea from the east. So Williamson is really showing that this is a huge trading area, and it's just possible that perhaps we're looking at a shift in trading emphasis rather than in, you know, than cultural. There's some cultural imposition, because I mean, as you absolutely say, we can't identify people by their grave goods. People are all using the same stuff, whether they are people whose ancestry largely lies in Britain, or whether they're people from abroad. And all research shows that most migrants, assimilate. But, they don't impose their culture on, unless they're colonial, of course. Don't tend to impose their culture on the places in which they settle. And the other thing, of course, is that when you think about that migratory period from over 200 years, from 400 to 600, there's a huge difference between people arriving in, say, 430 and people arriving in 590. We'll say that's a 160-year period. If we were to take 160 years away from where we are now, we'd probably get to 1860. So imagine British immigrants to America in 1860. How much would they actually have in common with any of us if we were to migrate to America ourselves now? And yet that's how we treat these people who are supposed to have come from Northwest Europe. And there isn't any evidence they did come, but had they come, they're not coming as a unitary group. They're not the same in 1 century as they are 200 years later. Yeah, sorry. You talked about language. I think language is very interesting.
Sure, yeah. Let's talk about language, because that is often one of the bits of evidence that is, let's say, if people want to stick to the traditional narrative, then that's one of their kind of trump cards, I would say.
That's right. That's the one thing people say to me. You might be so clever. How come we all speak English? They say, and they wag their fingers at me. How do we speak English?
And there's, of course, the fact that, Welsh, which is what we have now as the descendant of Brittonic, seems to not have had an influence on the English language, which, again, the trump card of the traditional narrative would be, well, if it was some sort of synthesis, if it was just trade and low-level migration, then surely those languages would have mixed together. So what do you think about language? It's a really tricky one, isn't it?
Well, there are three aspects to that question. The first is that Professor Peter Schrijver at the University of Utrecht and others have identified the ancestor of English as what they call a Proto-Germanic language, which was spoken all the way around the North Sea coast I think it's a kind of trading language, perhaps rather like Swahili. So when that was first spoken is difficult to say. It's a bit of a stretch. There are stories about people from Gaul, from the late Roman Empire, being settled in Britain, Germanic speakers, but from what we now call as Belgium. And so that's why Winchester was the Venta, the town of the Belgae, Venta Belgarum. There's a scholar in Oxford whose work is quite controversial, but still, who suggests that the words on Icenian coinage, which is coinage from the late Iron Age, just before the Roman conquest in Norfolk, that the words there are more intelligible if one regards them as Germanic rather than Brittonic. Just leave that there. So it's just possible. The thing that really interests me about English is how early it arrives. So by 550, there's a historian in Byzantium who refers to the people of this country as English. He calls them Angli. So already by 550, people are calling themselves English. And only half a century later, in 600, the early laws of Kent are written in English. And they're written in English because that was the language that most people spoke. And that's an incredibly rapid turnover. I'd love to know more about that. I don't know how quickly languages can be adopted in that way, such that everybody, that becomes the dominant language. But it seems extraordinarily quick for me that arrives by 600. So that's one strand. Another strand is about this thing about Brittonic, that there are very few Brittonic loanwords. More are being discovered, but generally speaking, it's true, there are not very many. There is an influence on syntax, on how sentences are constructed, which does seem to have an influence from Brittonic. But actually, when you look at the place names, people, there are no Brittonic place names, they say, in central and eastern England, which is where the Anglo-Saxons are supposed to have settled. And that's largely speaking true. There's not very many. But look at the place names again. So many of them have now got a Latin root, because in lowland England, that was the part of the country that was most exposed to Roman culture. By the end of the period, it seems very likely that most people spoke some form of vernacular Latin, and that they were also multilingual. They spoke Brittonic, they spoke late vernacular Latin, and perhaps those along the coasts also spoke some early version, some Germanic language, which they used for trade. But more than that, I can't say, but to assume that the linguists don't any longer assume that English is the consequence of invasion from the East. They say that English is what they call a contact language. You come into contact with it and you learn to speak it. So why did they adopt English rather than another? And again, Professor Shriver has an interesting explanation. He says that although English has rules, it's far more tolerant of mistakes than, say, German or French. So you can make mistakes in those languages, but it's regarded with much, much more distaste than in English, where you are allowed to make a mistake without everybody knows it's a mistake, but nobody minds quite so much. He says English is more tolerant of mistakes. So maybe he's right, I don't know. But until we start, really that's what I would love, is for the linguists to go away and say, okay, let's start again. Let's pretend we know nothing and see where that takes us. Maybe they'll end up where they have, who knows? But maybe they'll end up with somewhere different. But unless you ask the question, you don't know.
Yeah, I think it's, and I think the other thing is that it's just kind of one part of the picture, isn't it?
Yes,
it's just one part of the picture, and we can't say confidently what happened with language. Therefore, I suppose we can't use it as the basis of a whole explanation of the 5th century, for example. I think it is absolutely fascinating what you're saying, how by 600 clearly everyone, at least in Kent, is speaking English, which is, whereas, Patrick, for instance, clearly was speaking vernacular Latin,
Yes.
and Gildas knew very high Latin.
Yeah.
So what happens there is interesting, because, of course, if you were going to use Latin for anything, it would probably be writing laws, wouldn't it? But something happens, but we can't really say, I suppose. is the kind of, once again, the joy, but also the frustration of this period. If we move to another thing that we mentioned before, and another also, I guess, one of the old trump cards of the traditional narrative is towns. Is the idea that the Roman towns of Britain fell into ruin. That Britain once again became a rural society. Well, of course, it always was a rural society, but you know what I mean. The urban areas broke down. Now that, I think, again, the archaeology over the last 30 years or so is beginning to challenge to some extent. Wroxeter is the famous example. I think parts of Leicester have been excavated and showing. But do you think then that we're looking at continuity, or is it an evolution in how towns were being used? Probably more likely. We can probably disregard them all falling into ruin, correct?
There's some obviously do. I mean, look at Silchester, there are some, aren't there? But there's this marvelous book by Mateusz Fafinski, which has just been published, where he looks at Roman infrastructure. And he looked in particular in one section of his book at towns. And he makes the same point that James Gerard has made, which is that we see a change. We see that change from building in stone to building in wood as a decline in living standards. And so that is a back projection from our own, how we see things. Everybody, would apparently rather live in a stone house than a wooden one. But so that if things are different in the 5th century, does that necessarily mean things are worse? As far as the towns are concerned, it's true that the towns become less occupied, but then that was a process that had already begun in the 4th century. So we can't ascribe that to the 5th century. It simply was a continuing trend. But people did still continue to live in towns, and at least some of the activities of government were undertaken in towns. So you might not, the king or whoever he was, or the leader of a polity might not actually live in the town, but he might come to the town to make his laws, because what he's doing in that way is without saying it in so many words, he's demonstrating to the people who've come to hear him that he takes his authority, that he's the descendant of Roman authority, and his authority is rooted in the Roman Empire. And so there are many ways in which towns were used in this symbolic way, rather than necessarily in a material way. But then in other places, as you say, Wroxeter is one, Canterbury is another, there's clear evidence that towns continued to be occupied. It's just that people didn't think they were important anymore in the same way that they had been regarded as important in Rome. Fafinski argues that their importance largely moved from a symbolic, from a material importance, where they were the centers of Roman activity, to a symbolic importance of the sort that I've just described.
And I think it's one of the things, isn't it, that makes it easy to imagine. And I guess that's one of the reasons it's so alluring, the traditional narrative, is you can imagine, because we live in a modern urban society, people live in towns less, so clearly societal collapse. And again, it's easy to imagine a Roman town, Roman civilization. It's a lot less easy to imagine people farming the land for hundreds of years, because that's an experience that is completely alien to most modern Western people, I suppose, isn't it? So again, I guess that's one of the reasons it's so tempting to have this simple explanation. And a changing purpose of a town is less easy to just get your head around. It's more nuanced, isn't it?
It is.
One of the things that in our last episode, we talked to Max Adams, and if there was one thing that came out from him, it was that for him, I think he put it something like the thread that you can see on both ends. You can see it in the 4th century, and you can kind of see it in the kind of Bede's day once we get back into recorded history. Is for him, it was this idea of territorial lordship, of there being a lord controlling an area and the people in that area, often based on, say, watersheds, river basins around towns. And he really, one of his arguments about the 5th century is you can kind of trace from late Roman a kind of empire-wide process of the localization and privatization of the empire into much more individual, local, I don't know what the right word is, strongmen, taxing in kind rather than by currency. And that for him, that was what he looked at towns as, would be a 5th century center of local lordship, a privatization of the Roman state, of perhaps the same family who used to be, say, the garrison commander in Burd Oswald, or the person running a local town basically starts running it for themselves rather than for the emperor. But in many ways, that means that the local area itself changes little, or at least, outwardly, for the experience of people living there. Do you think that's a helpful way to try and understand this period? Or
it's an interesting way, isn't it? Because of course, Britain had always been regional. Now, if you look at the civitas capitals, the major towns of Britain, each of them had a territory around them. Each of the smaller towns had a territory around them. It was already divided into these small units. How they develop into the political units, which are really very difficult to find a word for. So mostly we try to call them polities because it's a way of just trying to avoid the whole problem altogether. As soon as you use any other word, it has implications which are too difficult and probably inappropriate. So how they develop from a late Roman area under particular administration into a polity that is identifiable in, say, the early 7th century is a very difficult question. I'm unconvinced, I have to say, about the privatization, principally because what one sees in the organization of these territories is that these are collectively governed. So everybody who is free and a member of the territory is entitled to own land in it. If they don't use the land, if they die intestate, then it goes back to the territory. It's owned by the territory. Territory, it's not owned by the king or the lord or whatever the word is for the leader. Only that person is allowed to alienate it. It doesn't belong to him, assuming it's a man. So everybody belongs to these units, and everybody who owns land is entitled to participate in the governance of that land. And you can see this, for example, in the Fenland, where if you map which villages had common rights and where they were able to exercise them. What the maps show you is a cluster of pinheads, all more or less next to each other, say in a semicircle. And you imagine the pins from the pin points leading from those pinheads more or less into a single place. And you've got a picture of a geographic unit. Now, the record of those rights of common is 12th century or later. But the reason that they appear to be so much earlier is because they predate the manorial system. And the manorial system begins to emerge and is around about the middle of the 7th century. And that's really putting it very strongly, but the privatization of land into very large estates starts to happen more or less around about 650. And manors don't map onto these collections of pinheads. And the lord of a manor, however powerful he was no better as a commoner with common rights than any other person. His manorial court was subordinate to the court of the commons. And Nellie Nielsen argued this in 1920, and nobody disagrees with her yet, that these rights of common predate the emergence of manors and go right the way, well, she says right the way back to the 5th and 6th centuries. So these are what they call folk territories, which are governed by assemblies of right holders, landowners, who have a leader of one sort or another, whatever you call him. And eventually, some of these units are preserved in medieval hundreds, was the ancient sub-unit of a county. Some of them are absorbed into other units. What we're seeing with them is a kind of snapshot in time of these units. But in Finland, those units survive from 400 to 1100, right the way into the 19th century, when hundreds were abolished. So you're looking at 2,000 years of collective governance, which runs alongside the emergence of manorialism, the imposition of a more feudal, but not exactly feudal structure by the Normans, the early emergence of capitalism, full-blown capitalism in the 19th century, runs alongside it and still exists today. You can see it in the Forest of Dean, you can see it in the New Forest, plenty of places up on the commons of Cumbria. These self-governing units, which have very, very ancient origins, are how I see late Roman Britain evolving. And then eventually, by the time you get into the 7th century, then you begin to see the emergence of kingship on a meaningful sort of scale.
And you do see, don't you, in a lot of the primary sources, references to, well, a lot of the primary sources, there's about 3 of them in there, but references to kind of councils and you know, that's, I think the famous appeal to Aetius, you know, is made by a council of Britain. And that does suggest that some form of collective leadership, you know, and that might suggest as well why we don't have any names other than pretty much Ambrosius Aurelianus, and that's it for the 5th century. The lack of a singular leader probably helps explain why no single figure comes to us. One thing I also wanted to pick up on, you mentioned it, I think, way back at the start about kind of dark soil, dark earth building up in the towns. And again, one kind of theory put forward is that if we are taxing in kind, then animals are brought to central places, and that this is almost kind of the evidence of animals being brought into the towns and then being used almost like corrals. But again, is that too tied into this idea of lordship that you would say emerges a bit later?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think if you were going to see that, you'd want to see what other evidence there was for, why they were being brought in. If there was some form of exchange, you'd expect to see that in the archaeology. Maybe it exists, and I don't know about it. So, this is my ignorance, not a definitive statement. There's been some suggestion that the remaining populations of towns were also expected to provide renders, and perhaps they turned some of the empty plots, farmed some of the empty plots. Along Hadrian's Wall, in places where military units were known to have existed, there's some suggestion that they were billeted in towns, and that the dark earth is the result of the land that they were given to cultivate to support themselves. So, I mean, I can't comment on those. It's quite possible.
No, again, I keep coming back to it, but it's the kind of the whole mystery of the period, isn't it? We can't really put it down to one simple thing. And indeed, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was different things in different places. One thing that you do see a lot of happening in the 5th, 6th, I think I'm right in saying 5th century as well as the 6th into the 7th, is a traditional, well, what was seen as a traditional Anglo-Saxon building being built in wood, a big hall, the Mead Hall. It appears in Beowulf, I think, as kind of central to Anglo-Saxon society. And I think in Wroxeter, some of the buildings kind of are not dissimilar to how you would imagine. I think Birdoswald as well, they build a big hall, it seems like. Now, one theory could be that, this is evidence of Anglo-Saxon tradition, culture, whatever. Does that fit maybe, I'm just completely making this up here, so you can completely disagree, but does that fit with maybe a more collective style of governance as well, though? Could this be an assembly point?
It might, I mean, I don't know. You're quite right that these very large halls are quite often built in Roman towns or on villas or places at Birdoswald. There's that wonderful one against the fort. They're regarded as places where the villa economy continued to exist as still a centre of lordship, and so goods were brought there, to be processed, or people lived in the halls and had processed the goods the stuff elsewhere. And that's a really interesting question, actually, and I don't know how to answer it, and it would be quite an interesting piece of research to take, and that is the dissonance between the folk territories on the one hand, which are well attested, and the continuity of some of these, or the continued existence, I should say, of some of these late Roman estates, and how the two mesh, and they may not be they may not be mutually exclusive. You might have a territory which includes one of those, or you might not, and it'd be quite interesting to try and work that out. There's recently they discovered a 5th century mosaic at Chedworth in Gloucestershire. So this is the first 5th century mosaic to have been found in Britain, because it was assumed all the villas went to pot.
I was going to say that's
ruins.
Yeah,
they found this 5th century mosaic, and what that means is that there were mosaicists, a family of mosaicists, or a business of mosaicists in, say, 390, whose business continued to operate over the following half century. So the mosaic they laid in 450 wasn't as good as the one that had been laid in 390, say, but it was, it was a fair enough mosaic. And so there seems to be growing evidence that there's some sort of villa ownership continuing. It's not it's not an opposition between no villas and lots of folk territories, but the two evolving together, and probably in some kind of regional pattern.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that at all, because of course that is one of the other things that, things like the mosaics disappear in the 5th century, but if they're still being made, that's fascinating. And it feels like there is just more, you can never really, because of the nature of archaeology, of course, we are always going to dig up more sites. So there'll always be new things. I think one of the big questions that comes out of this conversation then is the world that, once we get back into recorded history, so to speak, written history, I should say, really, of, say, Bede, is clearly a very different one from where the written record stops.
Right.
After around Gildas's time. Now, on the one hand, one of the themes from our whole episode, I think, today is, well, yeah, several hundred years had passed. Of course, the world was going to be different. And yet some of the things are starkly different. The language that is used for clearly both written and speaking, the vernacular, the towns that we've talked about have a different usage in the 5th century that we can't quite explain have, to some extent, stopped being used by Bede's day. And of course, you have a whole patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and kings who, at the very least, claim in, you know, things that come down to us like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and things like that, claim to have this lineage of Germanic kind of warlords who've set themselves up. Whether, you know, obviously that's true or not, that's what they think their past was. The kind of $1 million question is, how on earth do we get there from the interesting evolving world of the 5th century to the starkly Anglo-Saxon one that Bede lived in?
I mean, actually, that is the $1 million question. That's the sort of research that I hope that my book will stimulate. I think as far as language is concerned, it's important to remember that Bede did remark that most people are bilingual or even multilingual. They didn't only speak English, they also spoke in Latin, they also spoke Brittonic. In other parts of Britain, they spoke Pictish. In other parts of the islands, they spoke an early form of Irish. And of course, Brittonic was evolving into Welsh in Wales, but people weren't monolingual. Nowadays, we assume most English people, and probably isn't that true anymore, but English people tend to assume that they are monolingual. Actually, in most countries in the world, people are not. And so we should think about language differently. The towns, I suppose, because the emphasis of my research is on rural areas, you know, I kind of see towns as a bit of a red herring, but yeah, it's true, they evolve over time. And yes, I mean, the interesting thing is that over that period from 400 to 600, what one can see is an increasingly stratified hierarchy, an increasingly complex hierarchy, from what appears to be a pretty flat, not completely equal society in about 450, where some people are richer than others. By the time you're getting to 600, you're seeing the difference from people who have very little, and then gradations right the way up until you get, for example, to something like the Sutton Hoo burial. And that definitely is a change over time. The emergence of the kingdoms is a really very interesting phenomenon, and presumably, Stephen Bassett's compared it memorably to the FA Cup final, you know, it's a knockout until you only, you know, there are only a few left. The kings do trace, many of the kings do appear to trace their ancestry to some Germanic mythical person. But if you take, for example, the House of Wessex, the founders of the House of Wessex have Brittonic names. They don't have Germanic names. And it's thought that many of those genealogies are products of the 8th century and later, where court poets developed praise songs to be sung at court, where they simply made stuff up. But some of them go right the way, you know, so I was on the Ark, and I mean, the stuff that's really, you know, not credible. So it depends on where people thought their legitimacy could come from. The thing that really, I suppose, that encapsulates the answer for me is, there's a very famous statue in Derby Museum of Offa's predecessor as King of Mercia, King Ethelbald of Mercia, who died in 757, so absolutely mid-8th century. And it shows Ethelbald astride a horse. So the horse is looking out of the sculpture, is looking in one direction, but Ethelbald faces the viewer. So he's sitting sideways on his saddle, facing the viewer. And that stance of a man on a horse is absolutely taken from Byzantine coins. It absolutely locates Ethelbald as one of the rulers of a post-Roman world. And then when you look at his clothing, he has a Roman diadem around his head, but his haircut, you know, kind of mullet, is apparently Brittonic, and his moustache is Brittonic. And then he wears, I hope I get all this right, he wears a little Roman fighting skirt with leather strips, and his stockings, I think, are Roman. I can't remember. I might be garbling this, but but his mail is Germanic, and he has a little short sword, which also is Germanic in influence. So here we have a man who's the king of the strongest kingdom in Britain in the mid-8th century. And here is his last chance. This is his memorial to be represented, to say something about the identity of mid-8th century, the mid-8th century world. And what you see is a man who's completely oblivious of the kinds of distinctions that we've been talking about over the last hour and a half. He's not interested in who's Brittonic and who's Roman and who's Germanic and who's Byzantine. He simply is who he is, and his identity encompasses all of those strands, not the Byzantine one evidently, but the other three strands definitely are all interwoven into the identity that he is giving to the world, is presenting himself in this way. And how that happens, I mean, that is the fascinating question. That's the question. That's why I keep saying, forget what you think you know. Start with what the evidence says, because actually we're only at the very beginning of that process in unraveling how that happened. Mateusz Szczepiński's recent book does that very well by looking at Roman infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's not cheap. So I can't really recommend it because it's viciously expensive. But it's a great book.
It's always the way, isn't it? With new research. I think, it's something that one of the many pitfalls of, I think, studying this period, and indeed many periods from where we are today, is that we view it through particularly ethnicity and race through a lens of basically 19th century nation building, which just wasn't a reality before. And of course, it's such a big part of our reality that we can't imagine, or we struggle to imagine, a world without those kind of ethnic or racial or national divisions. And yet you just have to think about how many people from how many different places and how many different spoken how many different languages and would have looked so differently would have described themselves as Roman, just a bit before the 5th century. And as we've said today, possibly continuing into it in Britain, to think how identity didn't really work in the same way. And that's a fascinating picture. For something so late, so to speak, to have so much Roman influence. I guess my final question then is how much, we've called this series History's Most Puzzling Century, because it is puzzling. And so many things we've said today, ultimately, we get to the end of the discussion and say, well, maybe it might have been that, or maybe it wasn't. How much more do you think is out there? How clear a picture do you think we will ever have of what happened in the 5th century in Britain?
Well, I think there's always going to be more. I mean, that's the nature of archaeology, isn't it? And of any discipline. But I think that the more that we're going to know is going to be because scholars are going to be re-examining the old narratives and looking again. We already have a large amount of evidence. We need to know where it's going, what it actually means with a different perspective. Instead of using, as you say, that ethnic perspective, start asking, what does the evidence actually tell me, rather than using the evidence to try to confirm a pre-existing idea. And so I don't know how, I think that there will always be more, but I think we've already got enough to be able to start making those sorts of journeys now. And it's a very, very exciting time for the discipline. Very exciting, because we're effectively starting from scratch.
And I think that excitement, it really comes across in your book. I'll say again, The Emergence of the English is fantastic, because it takes the approach you've said all the way through, Susan, about starting from scratch. Let's see what we really can say rather than what we assume happened and fitting the evidence around it. So really all that remains is to say thank you so much for giving us so much of your time today.
Thank you for asking me. Thank you.
Peter.
Well, there'll be a link to her book down in the description. Please make sure that you check that out. And so thank you, Susan, for coming on the show. I've been Peter.
And I've been Alex, and thanks for listening.